action, authorized use of force, military assistance, and military advisors. Regardless of what name is used, the United States has actively been using its military might somewhere in the world for the past 63 years.
We have chosen areas to become involved in where you have internecine warfares going on for generations and generations, which are extremely difficult to deal with. You're not just going to go in and say, okay, fellas, let's change things overnight. We're going to make you, build you into a democracy like we have in America.
It is a sensitive issue. It goes back to this whole notion of should your culture trump my culture?
The United States asserts its power and military presence through an immense network of foreign military bases.
The 737 number is the official number. These are real military bases. This is American imperialism. It's out of control. One of the things that I study the base structure report every time a new one comes out is to see what they've left out. They've left out the bases in Kosovo. There are no mention of any bases in Afghanistan, 14 permanent bases in Iraq, none of the Central Asian bases. Many of them are omitted because it's too embarrassing to the country to admit that they've allowed American infidels to come in and set up a military base.
The four big ones that we've constructed in Iraq have Pizza Huts and Burger Kings and big BXs and naval PXs. They're really quite the city, quite the American city, very much like the bases we built in Kosovo and Bosnia. These are major permanent installations.
We don't mention any of the bases of any, or many of the espionage and secret bases in the British Isles that are disguised as Royal Air Force bases. There are no Englishmen on these bases, but through administrative agreements we made back at the beginning of the Cold War with Britain, we decided to call them RAF Tipperary Wells or something like that. And it turns out that it's basically a national security agency base for listening into people's telephones and things of this sort. There's a lot of them of that sort. Some of them are truly embarrassing. The big naval base at Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, where the British High Court has just after 40 years ruled that we and the British took every single inhabitant of Diego Garcia, rounded them up, and transported them to some islands nearby where they have lived in abject poverty and misery ever since. We simply rooted them out of their homes and took them away. This is the way the United States likes to do business, as a matter of armed force. This is our empire.
No foreign forces have set up bases on U.S. soil. This would be inconceivable to the American public. Yet U.S. troops are stationed around the globe, and with this often come problems for the local communities.
Rapes committed by American servicemen leading to court-martial. The rate has been running now since the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, well over 60 years, at 2 a month. It is about as bad public relations as you could conceivably imagine. We claim to have today 38 to 39 big bases. Those are interesting numbers because at the height of the British Empire in 1898, they had about 37. The Romans had about 35 major bases. If you are Dr. No and you really want to rule the world, you need about 35 to 40 really big, unbelievably expensive military bases. It's a way of life. It's militarism.
Since President Eisenhower's farewell address, his warning concerning the dangers of the military-industrial complex have not been heeded, and the problem has grown worse. Today, the military-industrial complex has unequaled influence over our government and military.
What's hard to understand is the failure of the Congress, the failure to exercise the powers of oversight, to use the power of the purse. Dwight Eisenhower's 1961 farewell address, in which he invented the phrase military-industrial complex. We in America actually have a long history of imperialism. What we don't have is a long history of imperialism backed by a huge military establishment. And that's what Eisenhower was talking about. It had grown out of control. If the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, we in America have not been particularly vigilant. It's now so deeply entrenched that there's a very good chance that we will not survive it.
We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. We must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite.
I think it's one of the wisest one in the time of the 20th century, and I think that Eisenhower is judged wrongly in this country. I think he was a very wise president.
Over the years, the Pentagon has become more reliant on outsourcing military functions to private contractors. These contractors have secured very lucrative contracts that not only supply weapons for the military, but provide support services, run military bases, and provide mercenaries. This influence even extends to areas of policy and strategy. Currently, private security contractors are not held accountable in war zones.
We've allowed unauthorized power, unsupervised power, wealth now combined with the military establishment. No military commander in the history of the United States has ever had to deal with the kind of large standing arms industry that we have brought into being since the end of World War II. It has the potential for immense grief for our society.
We're 5% of the world's population. We're close to a third of the world's economic power and more than half of the world's military power.
This idea of Eisenhower's military-industrial complex, kind of making its own game plan, well, guess what? I'm starting to see that with my own eyes.
I think we should go back to what was considered a failed policy in the 20s, which was to be isolationist. I call it restraint, and we should go back to being restrained.
Armed security companies, private military contractors, comprise the second largest force in Iraq, far outnumbering all non-U.S. forces combined. There are as many as 100,000 civilian contractors and approximately 20,000 private security forces.
Then you have all these contractors, favorite bogeymen or real bogeymen would be Halliburton, Bechtel, and the like. And then you have the military-industrial complex, much warned about, and a lot of that's been privatized, so we got a private military in effect.
There's enough private contractors in Iraq now that if you stopped all American official military activities, you'd still have plenty enough people to continue the war if the president truly wanted to do it. They're not counted, they're not recorded, and there is above all no oversight of this extremely lucrative activity.
We spent $22 billion on Iraq reconstruction and relief funds. That's it. Out of that $22 billion, 63% at least went to U.S. multinational companies. And the rest of that was to Iraqi companies that then purchased things from U.S. companies. All that money left Iraq. $2.3 billion went to one company, Bechtel. They like to make a point that they were hiring Iraqis for employment opportunities. Iraqis can rebuild their roads. They can rebuild their dams. Why do we need to hire U.S. companies to rebuild everything that Iraq built in the first place? They have engineers, they have the technical ability, and as far as supporting us, we destroyed their country. During the invasion, we eliminated key infrastructure to demoralize and destabilize the state. We really weren't reconstructing Iraq. We had these middlemen extracting at least 20% for profits, probably much, much more in the average case. And then you also have 20% of every contract for Iraqi reconstruction relief in Iraq goes towards security, which then you bring in the private security contractors.
I think the story of Halliburton was purely on decisions of expansion and war and imperialism. This is waking people up to the fact that there is an us and them.
We pay these contractors a significant amount more than we pay soldiers.
Halliburton is a major beneficiary of the war in Iraq. And it's driven by what? Oil. Look at the contract. Look at the first agreement we reached with the Iraqi government was to assure us that we have access to oil.